Hi, so we are going to learn how to whip stitch our point shoes. You might want to go ahead if you want to practice along and have your needle already threaded. I like to use dental floss currently, but also just good thread will work. And I like to do a double knot here. First, I'm going to show you a little illustration that helps me when I'm thinking about doing a whip stitch for point shoes as opposed to other methods. So this is just a spiral bound notebook, but do you see how the metal is reaching around and it's coming back through, and that's how it makes a spiral? I think we all kind of know how this is made, that it starts at the top and it twists through. This is kind of what you want to think about with a whip stitch, especially when we try to do the technique where we are sewing our point shoes so that it is invisible on the outside. So what I'm going to show you is a already whip stitched ribbon. My pets can't behave. So this is a whip stitched ribbon, and I kind of went a little overkill on this. I just love things to be super secure. So I started my whip stitch down here and I ran it all along the upper part. And then when I got to the top, it looks like I continued that whip stitch, which got a bit more tricky because have to negotiate the drawstring and not poke through the drawstring. And then I went down along the sides and I made a full box. That is just me. I like to really box it in, and I like my ribbons to go almost to the shank so that I really can pull up my arch. But you could bring this ribbon back to the top and do a smaller little rectangle section. So to begin a whip stitch, sometimes I'll just get the heel out of the way. Again, we're just gonna assume that you're maybe you've done your elastics, you've already crisscrossed them, or maybe you're working on your elastic. Either way, you can whip stitch it. So you've got to come in and you've got to go ahead and set your point where you're gonna make your, oh goodness, where you're gonna make your initial starting point. So I've just pulled this through, but I'm only going through the first layer of fabric. So just notice on your point shoe, most point shoes are going to have a double layer of fabric. I will say there are some newer shoes that they do not have traditional double layer point shoe fabric, and they have something more like synthetic and kind of like space agey. So if you're working with something like that, you can whip stitch through that whole layer, and I can talk about that in a minute, and I'll actually show you an example of a shoe I did that with. So I've pulled my thread here, and now I'm sticking my thumb through the hole, and I'm gonna get a little loop, and I'm gonna pull it really close to the shoe, and I'm gonna put my needle back through and make a little loop. So that now it's all stuck in there together, and I'm ready to begin my whip stitch. So I'm gonna think about that spiral bound notebook, and I'm gonna whip it there, and then I'll show you what to do when we get to the top. So I'm just poking through that first layer of fabric, and I'm using my other hand to kind of coax it out over here so that I don't go through that outside layer of fabric. And you can kind of feel it. You can feel it with your needle, how deep you're poking. You'll get used to it. You're just running it through, and you are going back again. I don't know why, but I always think of this as like Disney sewing. I think there's like some mice in Cinderella that sew, and it just looks like this. Like you're going in the same direction. Same direction. You just keep going with your hole outwards. And now I've got to move the loop over here so it doesn't get caught on my heel. And you're just going, going, going. All the way till you get to the top. Okay, so now we're at the top. And I'm going to negotiate this a little differently. So I'm actually just going to start my whip stitch now here as I'm running across the top. And my dog desperately wants to be in our video. And again, I'm going to, see that little loop? Didn't like that. Okay, there, we won't mess around with that. And again, there's two schools of thought here. Hold on, let me reprimand my dog. Okay, there's two schools of thought. You could do the poke in and out method at this point, because if you turn that point shoe over, if you were to go in and out, you would just be stitching right along here at the top, and you wouldn't see a whole lot. But in this shoe, I chose to just whip stitch through and through, which meant that I was doing something like this. I'm just basically making little loops again across the top. I'm trying to just grab a little bit of the fabric. I'm gonna try to show you what's going on behind the ribbon, if we can take a little peek. But I'm not grabbing the drawstring. It's not been grabbed. I'm just whip stitching through. Yeah, so you'd make your little box, and let's just pretend we finished up that whole box. Different ways to finish your point shoe, but I would just pull it there. Sometimes I make a little loop over itself. I think that there's a prettier way to kind of finish this, but I tend to just make a few loops over itself a few times. Sometimes I'll take it in and out, and then cut this and just tie it in a knot right there. I'm not gonna do that right now because all of this is excess, so I'm actually gonna rip it out, but this is a really good spot to kind of show you what happens if we do mess up. Whip stitches are really easy to take out. Just again, think about kind of working with that spiral. Now I made like several loops over in the same spot, but if I hadn't had made so many loops, you would basically just keep pulling every little loop out till you got to the end. Let's help our process there. You would just pull every little loop out to get back to where you needed to, or to take the whole thing out. Now, I want to show you a time that I whip stitched and caught all the fabric. Okay, so this is what happens when you do catch the fabric. Little wild. More of an aesthetic issue than a functional issue, but kind of outrageous. So this again is a double layer of fabric. These are a different style of elastics that I don't recommend. They're very flimsy. They're called invisible elastics, but they really don't give you much support. I think it really takes a specific type of dancer in a shoe that for whatever reason, anatomically, they don't need any type of support, but most people are not like that, so I don't recommend these. But this is a good example from the inside of what the whip stitch looks like, starting at the bottom, going up to the top, whipping around here. Only this was a time, of course, that I caught all the fabric. But it does illustrate to you what it should look like at the end of your journey. Now, placement, that is a whole other thing. I've got two very different examples of ribbon and elastic placement. Both shoes were worn by me, but the shoe models are different. So just goes to illustrate that these elastic and ribbon placements are really specific to the dancer. And so that's something we talk about in person, or potentially we could do another little video. But I hope that helped, and just so excited for your point journey. Bye.